So, the Star of Bethlehem. Just before I start the talk, let's just put ourselves in the mood. I hope you are all singing along there. So, in this talk, I'm going to look at the Gospel of St. Matthew, and I'm going to look at the account that describes the Magi journeying to Bethlehem, being prompted by a star in the east. I'm going to consider a few possible astronomical candidates and ask what are the possibilities and how well do each of those possibilities fit the account in the Gospel according to St. Matthew. Then we'll look at a few dates and ask what happened when, and do any known events actually fit the timeline of the Nativity. Then I'll use Starry Night, a planetarium software similar to the one we've just seen, and I'm going to wind the clock back 2,000 years and see what the sky looked like to get an idea of what the Magi might have seen. And then I'll summarise and finish. So, the Magi and the star in the east. There are 5 principal elements of Matthew's account that we would like to deal with in terms of finding a candidate for the Star of Bethlehem. And those 5 elements are as follows. We know the Magi journeyed to Jerusalem prompted by a star in the east. Bear in mind that the account, according to St. Matthew, does not talk about following a star. It talks about them being prompted to journey to Bethlehem or Jerusalem, being prompted by the vision of a star in the east. They asked Herod in Jerusalem about, what's this we hear about the new king of the Jews? And Herod was not aware of what they were talking about. He was unaware of a star that gave that message. The Magi then journeyed on to Bethlehem, where the star reappeared in the sky and finally stopped over Bethlehem. So in red there are 5 elements of the account in the Gospel of St. Matthew that we would like to try and address. If we can find an astronomical candidate which somehow is consistent with each of those 5 elements in red, then maybe we found a viable candidate for the Star of Bethlehem. So let's just one more time return to the Christmas Carol and listen to the lyrics to see what that tells us about the Star of Bethlehem. Okay, cut them off in their prime there. We 3 kings of Orient are. Let's just have a think about what that Christmas carol is telling us. We shouldn't actually be talking about 3 because nowhere in the account according to St. Matthew does it refer to the 3 magi or the 3 wise men. It's always assumed that there were 3 simply because there are mention of 3 gifts, the gold, frankincense and myrrh. If there were 3 gifts, it's assumed that there were 3 people. But there might not have been. There might have been 27 magi, of whom 3 brought gifts and the other 24 were just left staring at each other saying, I didn't know we were supposed to bring gifts. So it's assumed that there were 3, there's no actual number quoted, and therefore we shouldn't really have lyrics of we 3 kings of Orient are. We should get rid of the 3 because we don't know there were 3. We also don't think they were kings. They're referred to as magi, plural of magus, or wise men. So wise men or magi, astrologers, but not kings. So we shouldn't really be talking about kings either. So we 3 kings, we ought to get rid of kings. And we don't actually know where they came from. There's no mention of their homeland. We don't know if that was a little bit further east than Jerusalem or a long way further east. Was it the Near East? Was it India? Was it Mongolia? Was it the Far East? Was it Japan? Who knows how far east they would have come from. So we shouldn't be talking about a particular location. Perhaps Orient is very vague, but we don't really know where they came from. And as I've already said, the account according to St. Matthew does not talk about them following the star. They saw a star in the east and they went west. So we shouldn't be referring to following yonder star either. So you can see the Christmas carol is starting to fall apart very rapidly and is looking very threadbare already. So being a scientist, of course, I prefer precision and accuracy. So instead of "We three kings of Orient are" following yonder star, we really ought to rewrite this Christmas carol and get it a little more accurate. So it should be "We indeterminate number of men of unspecified geographic origin are" saw a star, not following yonder star. And now you can see precisely why physicists do not write Christmas carols. Clearly, the first one, although inaccurate, at least meters reasonably well. And one thing to remember is we should not refer to the 3 wise men. We should refer to the n wise men, where n is a number greater than 1 and presumably less than infinity. So, what are we talking about when we're talking about the Star of Bethlehem? The first thing we must bear in mind is that a star does not mean a star in the sense that we understand it. As astronomers, we know the difference between a star and a planet and other heavenly bodies, but here we should take star a little more liberally. Remember that with an adjective, star can refer to lots of different objects. For instance, a wandering star. We know that most of the stars are in fixed constellations. Yes, they move across the sky, but only because the Earth is turning. Most of the fixed stars stay fixed relative to each other, not fixed in the sky as such, but fixed relative to each other. And in addition, we have some other stars, some faint, some bright, that wander through the fixed stars. So a wandering star is what we would now call a planet. And some stars have got tails or hair. And a hairy star is a way of expressing what we would now call a comet. And of course, even now, colloquially, we still occasionally talk about shooting stars for meteors or meteor showers. So, wandering star, hairy star, shooting star, it's a reminder that stars or planets or comets or meteors could all be thought of as a star. We should just think of star as meaning something seen in the night sky, other than the moon, I guess. So let's just keep that rather broad definition of star for what comes later. Do we get any clues by looking at any depictions of the adoration of the Magi? Now, yes, of course, these were painted many centuries after the Nativity, but do we get any clues as to what the Star of Bethlehem may have been? Here we see the depiction by Botticelli. It's thought that that is Botticelli himself on the right-hand side, staring into the camera, as it were. So you could think of this as being a sort of one of the first selfies that just happens to have the adoration of the Magi in the background. We guess that that must be the Star of Bethlehem there, shining down the radiance onto the baby Jesus. It looks like this must be Joseph in the background, looking very bored and not taking any part in the celebration. Perhaps that's appropriate because apparently he didn't play any part in the conception either, so perhaps that's all well and good. Do we learn anything else by going back a few years? Here we see again a depiction of what is presumably the Star of Bethlehem in the background, but we don't get any clue as to what it actually is by looking at this painting. If we go back a little further, we find one of the few artists that actually depicts what is presumably the Star of Bethlehem as a comet rather than as what we would consider to be a star. So Giotto 1305, with what is thought to be perhaps an apparition of Halley's comet in the background. And when Halley visited us last time, the spacecraft that we sent to intercept Halley was named Giotto, effectively in memory of this particular painting by Giotto depicting the Star of Bethlehem like this. If we go forward a bit, here's Rubens. I'm not sure of the date on this one. Apparently this is one of the few pictures I could find, one of the few paintings I could find of the adoration of the Magi, which doesn't seem to show the Star of Bethlehem in the background. Unless perhaps it happens to be hiding behind that two-headed camel that seems to be putting its heads into the manger here. And again, just skipping a few years, we get what appears to be a star. Again, not necessarily a comet here, but a star that perhaps is just shining down onto the baby Jesus. And similarly, Van Lint 1630, again, a star in the background. All of these paintings, of course, show the 3 Magi, even though there's no evidence for 3, because that is simply what people expect to see. And the same is true of the Star of Bethlehem. These are not paintings as historical facts, they are just paintings of what the painters expect their audience to see. They expect to see the three magi, they expect to see Jesus, they half expect to see a Star of Bethlehem in the background, but these paintings don't actually give us any additional information, perhaps not surprisingly. We must remember the astrological significance of what was seen at the time. As astronomers, we tend perhaps not to think too much about astrology, but of course it was very important in centuries and millennia gone by. Every planet, every bright star, every zodiacal constellation in particular had some sort of astrological significance. So for instance, Venus was considered a symbol of beauty or a symbol of fertility or a symbol of birth. And Jupiter was linked to royalty. It was considered to be the king of planets. And if we think of a particular star, remember the star Regulus, from its name you can perhaps tell that Regulus is the king of stars. Regulus, of course, the brightest star in the constellation of Leo. And Leo itself was associated with the land or the tribe of Judea, simply because their symbol was a lion, and so the lion in the sky was thought to be linked to the lion on earth, the lion that represents the tribe of Judea or the land of Judea. So you must remember that for astrologers, looking into the sky and applying particular significance to particular planets or constellations or stars was how people would determine what was in store for them. In other words, if they wanted to know about the future, is it going to be a good year next year? Are we going to have a famine? Are we going to have a flood? Are we going to have a new king? If you want to know what's going to happen, you look at the sky, because that is where God tells mankind what he has in store for mankind. In other words, you can think of the sky as being God's Facebook page. This is where he will post information, and if you keep your eye on these Facebook pages, you'll get a heads up of what's likely to happen. So astrologers were always looking at the sky because they always wanted to know what was in store. So let's have a think about star candidates. We're going to have a think about a few possibilities, and then we're going to ask, does it match or is it consistent with the 5 aspects that I highlighted earlier in the account according to St. Matthew? If a particular star candidate we have, could it have been a star in the east? Could it have been significant? Is it possible that Herod wasn't aware of said star? Could this star reappear in the sky, and could this star stop in the sky? So let's have a look at a few candidates and see how many of those 5 boxes we can tick. Start with shooting stars or meteors. Could it be said that meteors could be a star in the east? Well, as you know, meteors can flash anywhere across the sky. They might come from a particular radiant, but in terms of where the star appears, no, there's no reason to say that the star would appear in the east. Would a meteor shower have been significant, astrologically speaking? Well, every night you would see meteors, and of course we get meteor showers coming round regularly throughout the year, and therefore there's no particular significance to the arrival of a particular meteor shower. Is it possible Herod wasn't aware of it? Well, he certainly wouldn't be aware of any significance attached to a meteor shower because they are so ubiquitous. Could the star reappear in the sky? Well, a meteor shower can appear at a certain time of year, and then those meteors might die away, and then another meteor shower might arise later that same year or the following year. So yes, in that sense, the star could reappear in the sky. Could a star stop in the sky? Well, it's difficult to see how meteors flashing all over the sky could be described as the star stopped in the sky. So it doesn't look like meteors match enough of those 5 elements of the account that we're trying to explain here. What about appearance of a comet? Can a comet appear in the east? Certainly can. Would it have been considered significant? Well, certainly if it was bright enough, it would have been considered significant. Comets are often thought to be not necessarily bearers of bad news, in some cases bearers of good news as well. Is it possible Herod wasn't aware of said comet? Well, if the comet was bright enough to be significant, surely it would be bright enough for Herod to be aware of it. It's said that Herod didn't have particularly good eyesight, but he would have had his own astrologers, and surely they would have told him if there was a new bright comet in the sky. Could a comet reappear in the sky? Well, yes, certainly it could. Comets go round the sun, and for a while they might be visible on one side of the sun, and then it might disappear for a while as it goes behind the sun, and then it could reappear on the other side. So yes, a comet can reappear in the sky. Could a comet stop in the sky? Well, generally comets move from night to night, as you saw with the comet Neowise that went by fairly recently. Generally speaking, the comet will move from night to night and cover a fair bit of ground. It is possible, depending on the geometry of how the comet is going around the sun, it is possible that for a while the comet might seem to come towards the Earth and seem to slow down in its traverse across the sky. So perhaps it's possible that you could say that the star stopped in the sky. So that's a little bit of a question mark on that one. What about the appearance of a nova? Despite its name, not a new star per se, but the appearance of a star that wasn't known previously. Either it was too faint to be noticeable, or it was below naked eye visibility, and for a while it became bright enough to be seen in the sky. So could it appear in the east? Certainly. A nova could in principle appear anywhere. Would it have been significant? Well, if it was bright enough, it could have been considered as significant, a new star appearing in the sky. Is it possible that Herod wasn't aware of it? Well, if it was bright enough to be significant, we come back to the question, why wouldn't Herod be aware of the fact that a new star had appeared in the sky? Could the star reappear in the sky? Maybe. Nova tend to brighten and then fade away, and it is possible for that same star to then re-brighten again sometime later. But usually not so much weeks and months, usually years, decades, or even longer in the future, that star might reappear again. So it doesn't seem to fit the timeline that the star could reappear and then a little while later appear a second time in the sky. And could the star stop in the sky? Well, a nova, like any other star, would be fixed relative to the fixed stars, relative to the constellations, and so there would be no sense in talking about a nova stopping in the sky, because a nova never moves relative to the fixed stars. So that doesn't seem to fit either. And a supernova might have been a spectacularly bright object, but it suffers from the same sort of problems as the nova. Yes, it could appear in the east. Yes, it could be significant depending on its distance and how bright it appears in our sky. But if it's bright enough to be significant, why wouldn't Herod be aware of it? And unlike a nova, generally speaking, a supernova is a star that's come to the end of its life and effectively blown itself apart. Once a star has done that, it doesn't tend to do it a second time. So we can't see how a star could reappear in the sky if that star was a supernova. Is it possible that the star stopped in the sky for the same reason as a nova? A supernova would not move relative to the fixed stars, so there would be no sense in talking about the star stopping in the sky. So we've thought about 4 possible stars, and none of them ticks all 5 boxes. But there is a 5th. And not surprising, that is the one that seems to be the most likely candidate for the Star of Bethlehem. And that is the conjunction of bright planets. And here I'm using the astrological symbol for conjunction on this slide and on future slides. Could a conjunction of planets occur in the east? Well, yep, planets are zooming around the sun at great speed, and they can effectively come into conjunction and appear in the same part of the sky, essentially in the east or the west, so yes, it could be a star in the east. Would it have been significant? Yes, depending on which planets and in which constellation, the astrological significance could be quite significant. Is it possible that Herod wasn't aware of said star? Well, I've put a tick here because it's possible that Herod was aware of the fact that planets have come into conjunction, but wasn't necessarily aware of the significance that could be applied to that particular conjunction. Could the star reappear in the sky? Yes, because planets are always on the move, so a conjunction can lead to another conjunction later on in the same year or the following year. So yes, a conjunction of planets can reappear in the sky, depending on which planets we're talking about. Is it possible for a star to stop in the sky? Again, it depends on which planets we're talking about, but planets can stop in the sky. Not in the sense that they stop going around the sun, but as seen from Earth, it is possible for a planet to appear to stop in the sky. So a conjunction of planets, in principle, could tick all 5 boxes. So let's have a think about the dynamics. I guess you probably know this, but just in case, let's make sure we're all aware of the fact that if we've got a couple of planets, it doesn't matter which they are, let's imagine we're observing some from somewhere near the sun, in the middle there, then the planets might be in the same part of the sky, but inner planets will move faster than outer planets, so as time goes by, these planets now appear in different parts of the sky, but at this point they appear at the same part of the sky, then they separate again, and at some time later the inner planet catches up, and again we now have those planets in the same part of the sky. This month with Jupiter and Saturn, the planets don't actually touch each other in the sense that in the sky they miss each other. Usually one planet goes slightly north or slightly south of the other. All of the planets are in planes that are slightly tilted relative to each other. They're not all exactly in the same plane, and so we don't expect planets to get arbitrarily close. They usually miss each other by a fraction of a degree or a few degrees, depending on which planets we're talking about. But what is important is that the inner planets go faster than the outer planets. And that is also relevant for making a note of how planets appear to move when we're talking about outer planets. If we imagine we're observing from the green planet, let's imagine that's Earth, and the red here could be any of the outer planets. It could be Mars or Jupiter or Saturn. When we're watching these outer planets, the outer planets tend to move from west to east across the sky. But because the inner planets are moving faster than the outer planets, every once in a while the Earth will overtake these planets on the inside track, as it were. So just like if you're in a car overtaking another car on the motorway, all the cars are going in the same direction, but if you overtake a car and you go faster, that car temporarily seems to be moving backwards relative to you. And that's what can happen when we watch the outer planets. In general, they will move from west to east, but every once in a while the Earth will overtake it on the inside lane, and that planet for a little while will start to appear to move backwards. This is the so-called retrograde motion of the outer planets. But why this is important is because the transition from a planet going as normal from west to east and then deciding to stop and go backwards, that means there is a particular time when the planet itself stops in the sky. Let's see that motion as seen from the Earth. We're starting from the bottom there, the planet moves west to east, but at some point will stop in the sky, move backwards, and then stop a second time, and then start to move forwards again. That will happen essentially once a year, depending, well, not necessarily once a year, depends on the period of the outer planet. Let's just see that again. The planet moves from west to east, but every once in a while will stop in the sky, start to move backwards, stop again, and start to move forwards. So it's nothing to do with odd motion of the outer planets, it's purely the relative motion of the Earth relative to these outer planets. And that's important with respect to what's about to come. Let's have a think about timeline. Here I've got the decade or so prior to 1 AD or 1 BC. Wind back the clock 2,000 years, bear in mind that some planetarium software that you might be using, if you go to 1 AD and then go backward a few months, sometimes they click over and tell you you're now in year 0. But bear in mind there is no year 0. It goes from 1 AD, go backwards 1 year, you're in 1 BC. There is no 0. So any planetarium software that tells you you're in year 0 has miscalculated the actual date. So if anybody is trying to reproduce what I'm going to be showing you shortly, check whether or not there's a year 0 first. Okay, so when was Christ born? Some people believe that Christ was born somewhere around 6 BC, give or take a year or two. So perhaps between 4 and 8 BC. Part of that assumption is based on the fact that Herod died in 4 BC and Christ was born before Herod died. I say the fact that Herod died in 4 BC, depending on how you do the calculation, you can arrive at the result that Herod died in 4 BC. However, Part of that is based on Herod died after a lunar eclipse, which came after this event, which came after a flood, which came after a... Basically, events are dated according to other events rather than an absolute fixed calendar. So when we're trying to pin down what happened when, in terms of when did this emperor cease his reign or when did this king die, we have to be careful because everything is related to some other event. And some biblical scholars, I can't comment on how valid this is, but some biblical scholars believe that the death of Herod has been miscalculated because they've taken the wrong lunar eclipse. And he didn't actually die after the lunar eclipse that came prior to 4 BC. He died after the lunar eclipse that happened in something like 2 BC, and Herod actually died in 1 BC. Now, if Herod died in 1 BC, that means Christ might have been born in a few years prior to that. So we don't actually know. There's a big uncertainty as to whether Christ was born around about 6 BC or around about 2 BC. And that's relevant when we start looking at what happened when in this timeline. So let's ask ourselves, of the candidates, we're not particularly convinced about the candidates other than conjunctions, but let's ask ourselves anyway, were there any comets around that might have fitted the bill? Well, there was a comet around in 12 BC, and it was probably quite a bright one. It was Halley's Comet. And given that we've seen it quite a few times, and each time it's been quite a spectacular sight, there's no reason to believe it wasn't quite spectacular in 12 BC. But wasn't this a bit early for a heads up? If this was supposed to be a portent of a new king of the Jews is on his way, isn't 12 BC a little bit too early? It's either 6 or 8 or 10 years earlier than the event it's trying to prophesy. So God was a little premature in his Facebook posting if that was the Star of Bethlehem. What about other comets? One comet was around in 5 BC, that was Comet Holmes. Perhaps some of you photographed Comet Holmes when it last came round. For us, it was when 2007. Remember, that was the one that the coma suddenly expanded enormously over a period of about 24 to 36 hours. But it's unlikely that Comet Holmes was particularly bright. It was in the right part of the sky. In principle, it was in the sky, but we don't think it was bright enough to be a spectacular comet at the time. In 4 BC, there was another comet. That was the comet Churyumov-Gerasimenko. That's the Rosetta comet, because the other name is too much of a mouthful. So that's the comet that was visited by Rosetta and had the Philae lander. But again, this would have been, although in principle it was in the sky, you can plot where it is, it's unlikely to be particularly bright. We have to bear in mind that comets are like cats, they have tails, and they are completely unpredictable. By which I mean we know where they are in the sense that we can work out from their orbit what they are doing now and wind the clock back to work out where they were in the sky. Trying to calculate how bright they would have been is more difficult because that depends on the sun evaporating the ice and forming the tail, which then reflects sunlight. But we don't think that either of those two latter-day comets, the 4 and 5 BC, we don't think those would have been anywhere near bright enough to be spectacular. Halley, maybe, but it was too early. The other comets, unlikely. What about nova? Well, apparently there were some nova around, although we don't think they match the account according to St. Matthew. There were actually a couple of candidates. According to the Chinese, there was a nova in 5 BC. And according to the Koreans, in their written records, there was a nova in 4 BC. Now, maybe there were no nova for hundreds of years and then 2 come along at once. That doesn't seem very likely. So what's more likely is when we look at the written records and we try and match the Chinese and Korean dates to our Julian calendar or Gregorian calendar, it looks like maybe they've gone slightly awry and maybe we're talking about late 5 BC or early 4 BC, and actually these are one and the same nova that was seen by both the Chinese and the Koreans. So there is something there at about the right time. It's getting a little bit late, but yeah, they're just about pre-4 BC, like those two comets, but they don't seem to tick the boxes to be the Star of Bethlehem. But if we look at conjunctions, now it starts looking really interesting. We have a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. I'm using the astrological symbols down here written out if you've forgotten what's what, just for brevity, a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn that would have been around at about the right time for Christ being born, somewhere around 6 BC. And there was also conjunctions of Jupiter and Venus around about 2 BC. So there were conjunctions at the right time, regardless of whether you think Herod might have died in 4 BC or whether Herod died in 1 BC. Now, this conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn is in many respects similar to the one that's coming up in a couple of weeks or so. Less than that now, isn't it? A week. In a week, we're going to have a conjunction very similar to that one, by which I mean Jupiter, quite a bright planet, Saturn, not so bright, coming into conjunction and being separated by a distance less than the diameter of the full moon. In other words, only a few arc minutes. So they would have stayed as 2 separate objects, Jupiter being rather brighter than Saturn, but Saturn should still be visible as a secondary object. But what I find much more interesting is to consider the conjunctions of Venus and Mercury rather than Saturn. Venus and Mercury, Jupiter and Venus rather than Jupiter and Saturn. And that is because Jupiter, as you know, can be quite a bright planet, so -2, -3, -4. Saturn tends not to be so bright. At the moment, Saturn is a positive magnitude. It's a magnitude of about +1/2, whereas Venus, at its brightest, at about -4 or -4.5, could be potentially 100 times brighter than Saturn. So a conjunction of Venus and Jupiter could be a lot more spectacular in principle than a conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter. So not only is it much brighter, we have an astrological significance which is more relevant, and we have one final point which I'll come to towards the end when I show the Starry Night software. So let's have a look at the conjunction that I'm talking about that occurred between 3 and 2 BC, and then something very interesting that happened some months later. So here I'm using Starry Night software, and I've not labelled everything, because if I label everything it gets far too confusing when you start running the clock forward and time lapse over many weeks or many months. So I'm looking in the direction of Leo there. As you can see, there's the constellation of Leo, there's the constellation of Cancer, Gemini off to the right. I've labelled Jupiter just so we can tell what's going on. I haven't labelled the other planets, and I haven't labelled the stars. As I say, the labels just get rather confusing. So we know that that is Alpha Leonis, that is the brightest star in Leo, so that is Regulus there. I've set the clock at the moment to the 1st of August 3 BC. And I don't know where I should be looking from. I don't know where I should have as the location to see the sky, because I don't know whether the Magi were in the Near East, the Far East, Mongolia, India, whatever. So I've simply said the viewing location, let's just leave it at the centre of the Earth. That means that I could be a few thousand miles off, depending on where on the surface of the Earth we should be, but it's not going to make that much difference to working out where the planets are in the sky. So that should be close enough for our purposes. So it's August of 3 BC, we're looking in the direction of Leo, and I am not going to show labels, and I am not going to show where the horizon is, because again, as soon as you start moving forward in time, the horizon moves around and it starts getting either confusing or nauseous, depending on your situation. So let's have a look at what happens in a few days as we run the clock forward. There's Jupiter, and coming up behind it is the planet Venus. Remember, Venus is one of the inner planets, so it's going around the Sun much faster than the outer planets, so Jupiter tends to move quite slowly, Venus tends to move quite quickly. So Venus is moving from west to east and is going to catch up Jupiter. So let's run the clock forward and have a look at what happens. So Venus and Jupiter get very close in the sky on the 12th of August 3 BC. So remember, Unlike the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, this is two very bright planets. Venus is brighter than magnitude -4 at this point. Jupiter not quite as bright, but two very bright objects are getting very close, similar in distance to the conjunction that we're going to get in a week's time. In other words, arc minutes apart, only a small fraction of the diameter of the full moon. Still two separate objects. Anybody with reasonable vision will be able to make out these two bright dots as two dots. But this particular conjunction, this star if you wish, would be seen as a star in the east. The sun is further east, so this particular conjunction of Venus with Jupiter in the constellation of Leo would be seen in the east before sunrise. So this could be recognized as a star in the east. Why do I think the astrological significance of this is more relevant than the earlier conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter? Well, it's because we're talking about Venus and Jupiter in the constellation of Leo. Venus, a symbol of birth, Jupiter, a symbol of royalty or kingship, and Leo is associated with the line of Judea. Venus, Jupiter, Leo, birth, king, Jew. So that particular astrological significance could be read as, if there's a star in the east in August 3 BC, that is telling us something interesting is about to happen, and it relates to birth of the king of the Jews, because it's Venus, Jupiter and Leo. Right, so we have a close conjunction of a few arc minutes, just discernible as two separate but very bright points of light. What happens in the next few months? Let's roll the clock on. Venus will continue to move to the east and will move out of our field of vision. Jupiter, you notice now, passes the star Regulus. So Jupiter is in conjunction with the star Regulus. The king of planets has just passed the king of stars. And what happens in the next few days is Jupiter continues to move but slows down and then stops in the sky, because the Earth is overtaking on the inside. Jupiter is now moving backwards. We're still moving the clock forward. Jupiter is now moving backwards in the sky. We're now in January of 2 BC, and Jupiter passes Regulus a second time. The king of planets has just passed the king of stars a second time. And Jupiter now stops in the sky for a second time and then resumes its forward motion again and passes Regulus a third time. The king of planets has passed the king of stars not once, not twice, but 3 times. So the retrograde motion is not that unusual. That will happen every once in a while. But here, the retrograde motion, whereby Jupiter goes forward, then backwards, then forwards again, that happens all centered around the star Regulus. So a triple conjunction of the king of planets with the king of stars. Astrologers might interpret that as one king is sort of dancing around another king, and maybe one king is passing the crown to another king. Maybe that's what's happening. We've had a heads up a few months ago about birth of the king of the Jews. Maybe we're now being told that one king is going to pass the crown to another king. Maybe. So the astrologers are getting very interested and are staring at the sky in case anything else happens that tells them quite definitely something very interesting is going to happen in the land of Judea. And what happens in the next month is what I find particularly interesting. Venus is now back again. Venus, remember, has gone round the sun quite quickly, and it's come back round and is catching up with Jupiter again. So again, Jupiter's going to move to the east slowly. Venus is going to move to the east rather more rapidly. So let's see what happens in the next few weeks. Venus is in conjunction with Jupiter again. Not only that, not only have we got again a very bright planet and a very bright planet in conjunction with each other, the same two planets, Venus, Jupiter, in the same constellation, Leo, so we've got birth, king, Jews again. But look at how close this conjunction is. The conjunction we've just talked about a few months ago is similar to the conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter that we're getting later this month. They're separated by a few arc minutes. Let me centre up Jupiter and then zoom in. I'm going to zoom in by about a factor of 1,000. Now, of course, a factor of 1,000, no one had telescopes and therefore you couldn't possibly see this, but just to show you how close this conjunction was, have a look at this. That's how close Jupiter and Venus were in the sky. In this particular planetarium software, Venus is not shown as brilliant white atmosphere. It's shown as the surface of Venus as a radar image. So you have to imagine that Venus is exceptionally bright and is right next door to Jupiter. The particular field of view that I'm showing you at the moment is only 1 arc minute from top to bottom. So the separation of the two planets is measured in arc seconds, not arc minutes. I don't believe any human alive could ever separate those as two separate objects. I don't think human vision is ever that acute. And therefore the astrologers would have seen these bright objects come together night after night, and they would effectively fuse into one very bright object. They're very bright in their own right, but at the point where they come together for perhaps a day either side, they would have fused into a single object. I am not too sure how often you would get a conjunction like that. I'd be very surprised if it happens very often in 1,000 years. So any astrologer that would see two bright planets come together and fuse into one, I am fairly sure we can take it that no astrologer would have ever seen that in their lifetime. And therefore this would have been an exceptional event that came after the original conjunction, the star in the east, which told them birth of the King of the Jews, followed by a triple conjunction of Jupiter with Regulus. One king is passing the crown to another king, and then a few months later this happens, which tells them, why are you still at home? Why have you not already started your journey to the land of Judea to pay homage to the King of the Jews? So we can think of a summary of what the Magi might have seen by just summarising what we've seen in that planetarium software. In 3 BC, Jupiter and Venus come close, arc minutes apart, close enough to be spectacular but still separated as two dots in the sky, and the astrological interpretation of Venus and Jupiter in Leo could be birth of the King of the Jews. In the next few months, the King of Planets passes the King of Stars not once, not twice, but 3 times, a triple conjunction of Jupiter with Regulus. Perhaps this is the passing of the crown. And then this absolutely spectacular conjunction of the same planets, Venus with Jupiter, in the constellation of Leo, reinforcing birth of the King of the Jews, absolutely spectacular. That's the starting pistol. Go now and pay homage to the new king. How long might it have taken them to get there if that was the starting pistol? Well, we don't know. We don't know how far they've journeyed because we don't know what their homeland was, and we don't know if they were walking. Christmas cards tell us they were on camels, but were they on camels? Were they walking? We just don't know. So it might have taken them weeks, it might have taken them many months to arrive at Bethlehem. One possibility is they didn't get to Bethlehem until some months later. Why have I put December there in that last box? Well, pure conjecture. But if they didn't arrive till December, what happens in December? Jupiter stops in the sky one more time. Just like it did earlier, because of the retrograde motion, Jupiter comes to a halt in the sky during December, stops in the sky, and then after a little while starts to move backwards again. So it is possible that the Magi arrived in December, and that's where they saw the star stop in the sky over Bethlehem. What date does it actually stop in the sky? Well, it's actually 25th of December. Yeah, I know. That's pure coincidence. We know that the celebration of Christmas on the 25th of December was simply overtaking an old pagan festival celebrating the end of the longest night. But it is interesting to note that if we think about those events, then we can tell a story in which an astronomical candidate fits with the astrological significance and the timing fits with what we take as happening from the account according to St. Matthew. So maybe that was the Star of Bethlehem. Maybe the Star of Bethlehem was a conjunction between Venus and Jupiter in the constellation of Leo. Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was something completely different. Maybe it was actually the 6 BC conjunction. Doesn't fit astrologically, but it might have, and it's not nearly as bright. It was perhaps 100 times fainter than the conjunction I was talking about. And it doesn't seem to fit quite the astrological story, but maybe we are just trying to make everything fit. Maybe it was some other astronomical event. Maybe it was a combination of events that actually spawned the idea of the Star of Bethlehem that made it into the Gospel according to St. Matthew. Determining the astronomical facts is not difficult. We know the positions of the planets accurately enough now that we can wind the clock back 2,000 years without too much of an issue. Winding the clock back 2 million years is an issue where we haven't got that precision. But if we only want to go back 2,000 years, then we know we've got it about right. If you try different astronomical software, they might not produce the same time for the conjunction to the nearest second, to the nearest minute, but they will tell you that conjunction took place and it was that sort of distance, arc seconds between them, not arc minutes, not degrees. So the astronomical facts can be determined. But second-guessing the significance that the Magi or any other astrologer would have attributed to those events, that's a different matter, because that, of course, is just pure speculation. So I'm not saying this is the Star of Bethlehem. I'm saying we know those events occurred, and if you follow the timeline, it's consistent with the Gospel according to St. Matthew. Regardless, of course, the underlying message is still the same. May you have a very peaceful and a Merry Christmas. Thank you all very much for listening.